will start this morning with a reading. It's a passage from I've Been to the Mountaintop by Martin Luther King Jr. And I think it's a little bit of a lesser known passage, but it is so wonderful that I had to share it with you all. If I were standing at the beginning of time, with the possibility of taking a kind of general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? I would take my mental flight by Egypt, and I would watch God's children in their magnificent trek from the dark dungeons of Egypt through, or rather across the Red Sea, through the wilderness, and on toward the Promised Land, and in spite of its magnificence, I wouldn't stop there. I would move on by Greece and take my mind to Mount Olympus, and I would see Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides, and Aristophanes assembled around the Parthenon. And I would watch them around the Parthenon as they discussed the great and eternal issues of reality. But I wouldn't stop there. I would go on, even to the heyday of the Roman Empire, and I would see developments around there through various emperors and leaders, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even come up to the day of the Renaissance and get a quick picture of all that the Renaissance did for the cultural and aesthetic life of man, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even go by the way that the man for whom I am named had his habitat, and I would watch Martin Luther as he tacked his 95 Theses on the door at the church at Wittenberg, but I wouldn't stop there. I would come up to 1863 and watch a vacillating president by the name of Abraham Lincoln finally come to the conclusion that he had to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even come up to the early 30s and see a man grappling with the problems of a bankruptcy of his nation and come with an eloquent cry that we have nothing to fear but fear itself, but I wouldn't stop there. Strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. Now that's a strange statement because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick, trouble is in the land, confusion is all around. That's a strange statement. But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And I see God working in this period of the 20th century in a way that men in some strange way are responding. Something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same. We want to be free. Stories about stories surround us. And so this is a story about a story about a story. I think that's how many layers it is, but you'll figure it out. This Christmas, I thought it was finally the time that our oldest child was finally old enough that I could show her my favorite piece of holiday cinema without totally scarring her. And so I got out my VHS of the Muppet Christmas Carol, popped it in my VCR. That's, so the past was great. The 90s were great, all right? Me and my VCR are gonna stick around. And we made it through most of the way, and then we got to the Spirit of Christmas Not Yet Come to Pass, which those of you who are familiar with various cinematic rehashings of the Charles Dickens story know that it's basically the Grim Reaper, right? It's like a spectral being in a black cloak that doesn't talk. It just sort of like the music does this sort of like terrifying screech while it points its like bony hand under its cloak. And various awful things are happening right? We see that Scrooge learns that nobody particularly cares that someone has died, and that's all sort of, puts us on edge. But then we come to what I think is absolutely the most heartbreaking scene in the entire movie, which is where the spirit of Christmas not yet come to pass takes Scrooge to the house of the Cratchits. And somehow, I do not know how Kermit the Frog and Miss Piggy make me cry every time, but they do. And we learn that in this future that has not yet come to pass, but will if things aren't changed, we learn that the sickly child of the Cratchits, Tiny Tim, has died. Right? And Tiny Tim has died because his parents are too poor to afford care. And the man who is the reason that they are too poor to afford care has to stand there and watch them grieve. It's objectively terrifying. And I thought my kindergartner was ready. She wasn't. And she was heartbroken, just awfully distressed, and I immediately started backpedaling, spoiling everything. It's fine. Tiny Tim lives. It's fine. I promise it's fine. It's fine. Tiny Tim lives. Scrooge changes his mind. The music is going to be happy again. It's so close. We're so close. There's a really great production number coming, full of Michael Caine and singing Muppets. I promise. I was torn, though, inside between my enormous attempt to make her see that it was all going to be okay and the part in me that knows that in real life, it's not always okay. Cliffhangers, like all of us wondering the first time we experience the story of A Christmas Carol, does Tiny Tim live or die, right? That's one of the big cliffhangers in it. Cliffhangers first came to popularity as a literary device in the 1800s with fiction writers like Charles Dickens, because many of their stories that we now think of as novels, like Great Expectations, David Copperfield, they began as serialized fiction, which meant that they were published bit by bit, and the way you got people to buy the magazines was if you wrote a really good cliffhanger at the end of one section so that people had to buy it again the next month, because they had to know who shot JR. Right? And the name cliffhanger refers to the idea that someone is hanging by that tenuous grip as they dangle over a steep ravine, right? That's where we left off, with someone hanging on by the edge over a pit of crocodiles, or other scenario of perilous uncertainty. And of course, there are lots of ways to create that sense of profound and dangerous suspense. There's Han Solo frozen in carbonite at the end of The Empire Strikes Back. There's Olivia Pope from Scandal in the hands of kidnappers. There's Ross Geller saying the wrong woman's name during his wedding ceremony in an episode of Friends. There are lots of ways to create perilous suspense in your life. But of course, our real lives, the ones that happen outside of those stories, can have that cliffhanger feeling too. Anyone who has waited for news about a diagnosis, a job offer, or a loved one's whereabouts in a disaster, right? Anyone who has lived a human life knows all too well that perilous uncertainty isn't just a way to sell fiction. It's a reality of human life. And this feeling of perilous uncertainty that we are hanging on by our fingertips above a pit of hungry crocodiles, maybe it feels more present than usual. As we stare down the second inauguration of Donald Trump tomorrow, in these times, over the pit of hungry crocodiles, it's easy for our most well-worn pathways of thought to be about all the things that might happen to us, all the hard things that might come to pass, all the difficulties that might visit us. all the things there are to fear, all the very reasonable reasons that it would be foolish to stop and help someone by the side of a dangerous road. Right now, it feels really easy to ask myself the question, what will happen to me if I stop and help? Because there's a more frightening answer than usual that waits for us today, tomorrow, perhaps. And in a world where there is so much worth fearing for so many of us, I want us to hear the invitation of the second half of that name, Unitarian Universalism. And Universalism began, right, as a refutation of the idea of eternal damnation. But we've gone through several iterations of our family tree of ideas about the afterlife, etc. And the universalism we practice today is less about an eternal question, about damnation or salvation in an afterlife, and more about the question we have for each other in this life, about caring for one another in this life, about eradicating hellish conditions in this life for one another. Right? As universalists, our source of hope is wrapped up in the flip of the question. Right? Not what will happen to me if I stop and help, but what will happen to them if I don't. And so this cliffhanger moment is less about ruminating on the fear and more about jumping off from the place of what can I do? Because human beings, one of our worst habits is our belief that we are in control of a lot of things that we are objectively not in control of. We are, in fact, in control of very little, and that makes us very cranky. And it makes us behave very badly in human relationships sometimes. But that reality of the tiny sphere of control we do have makes me think of this other, more famous piece of I've Been to the Mountaintop from Martin Luther King, where he says, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. Right? It's an invitation to acknowledge that we are only able to control a little bit about how we live in the moment we're given. And the idea that I've been to the mountaintop is a reference to the story of Moses in the Bible, who goes to the mountaintop, right, receives a vision of the world that could be, and then is sent to wander in the desert with his people for 40 years, which if you do the math about the sort of healthcare available in the desert and the age Moses was when he started wandering, like the listeners of the first times those stories was told did, right, that Moses will in fact not go to the promised land. Moses will meet his end wandering in the desert. Right? And for Martin Luther King, he believed that, like Moses, that God was directing him as part of some longer story. But you need not hold that particular belief to acknowledge the truth that you really only have control over a little piece of this life you have been given. Right? We don't have to experience that, and Martin Luther King certainly didn't experience that as that lack of control as meaning, it's all in God's hands, so I don't have to do anything. Right? Instead, that lack of control can be an invitation to do something, to do the thing we can do, to not let our fear drive the bus. Right? We can choose to care for our neighbors even when it will cost us something. That's the flip of the question, right? Even if it costs me something, can I care for my neighbors in this moment? Because I wish I could tell you with certainty that there is a production number with Muppets coming just around the corner, and that Tiny Tim is definitely not gonna die, and if we just wait for the next installment, it's all gonna work out. Of course Ebenezer Scrooge learns to ask the question, what will happen to him if I don't help? But the truth is that I don't know what's in this next chapter. Whether it's a tragic epilogue, a difficult middle installment in an ultimately triumphant trilogy, or just a blip in the universe. It might be all of those at once. But how you approach this time is up to you. How we approach this time is up to us. Right? I don't know if we will see the promised land together. I don't know what's waiting around the corner of this page we would rather not turn. But I know that we all have the gift of being alive right here in the first half of the 21st century. We have the gift of hanging by our fingertips together. What a gift. May it be so.